Rich man fires elderly worker, only to discover later that the man is his long-lost relative, leading to an unexpected reunion. Gideon Thorne sat in his luxurious office in Portland, surrounded by polished wood and expensive art. The city bustled outside, but inside, a heavy silence weighed on him. He stared at the spreadsheets on his computer, numbers dancing before his eyes, yet they brought him no joy. Success had become a hollow shell, filled with emptiness. His gaze drifted to the window, where the skyline glittered in the afternoon sun. He had built an empire, yet he felt lost. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. It was Arthur Pritchard, a longtime employee with silver hair and a weary smile. Arthur had dedicated over 30 years to the company, and today, Gideon had made a choice that would change everything. "Come in, Arthur," Gideon said, forcing a smile that felt unnatural. Arthur stepped inside, his demeanor calm, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of concern. "You wanted to see me, sir?" "Yes." Gideon took a deep breath, the words heavy on his tongue. "I've been reviewing the company's performance, and I believe we need to make some changes. For the sake of efficiency, I have to let you go." Arthur's face fell, the weight of Gideon's words crashing down like a tidal wave. "I see," he replied, his voice steady but laced with sadness. "After all these years, you think that's the best decision?" Gideon felt a pang of regret, but pushed it aside. "It's not personal, Arthur. It's business." Arthur nodded slowly, his head hanging low. "I understand." He turned to leave, each step echoing in the vast office. Gideon's heart sank as he watched the man who had dedicated his life to the company walk away. As the door clicked shut, an unexpected sorrow washed over Gideon. Why did it hurt so much? He had made a decision meant to propel the business forward, yet something deep within him ached. He glanced at the family photo on his desk, smiling faces frozen in time. The moment felt like a cruel reminder of what he had sacrificed for success. With a shaky hand, he picked up the frame, tracing the edges with his fingers. The laughter captured in the image felt distant, just like the joy he once knew. Gideon's mind swirled with questions. Was this the man he wanted to be? Alone in a tower of glass and steel, devoid of meaningful connections. He set the photo down, trying to shake off the feelings that threatened to engulf him. Just as he was about to resume work, an old letter slipped out from a stack of papers on the corner of his desk. He had forgotten about it, a relic from a time long past. Curiosity piqued, he opened it, reading the faded ink with growing interest. The letter spoke of family and loss, of the ties that once bound them together, a reflection of a life he had never fully embraced. As he read, a knot formed in his stomach. The words stirred something deep within him, a whisper of unfulfilled dreams and unresolved emotions. He glanced at the door, half expecting Arthur to walk back in, but the office remained silent. Gideon's thoughts spiraled. What had he done? He had severed a connection that might have held more meaning than he realized. The letter slipped from his fingers, landing on the desk with a soft thud. Doubt crept in, gnawing at the corners of his mind. Was firing Arthur truly the right choice, or had he just condemned himself to a life of regret? He leaned back in his chair, the weight of his actions pressing down on him. The luxurious office that once felt like a fortress now felt like a cage. The city outside continued to thrive, unaware of the turmoil brewing within him. Gideon closed his eyes, seeking solace in the chaos. Could he find redemption? The question lingered in the air, heavy with the promise of change. Arthur Pritchard sat alone in his small, dimly lit apartment. The walls were bare, telling stories of a life filled with hard work and sacrifice, but lacking in warmth and affection. After 30 years of dedication to Gideon's company, he had been dismissed without a second thought. The shock of it all left a bitter taste in his mouth. He stared at the faded photographs on his desk, memories of a family he had lost touch with long ago. Was it all worth it? He whispered to himself. his voice barely breaking the silence. Arthur thought back to the times he had missed family gatherings, the birthdays, and the holidays. He had chosen work over family, believing it was the right path. But now, he felt the weight of regret pressing down on him. "I sacrificed everything, and for what?" he muttered, shaking his head. As he looked out of his window at the bustling streets of Portland, Arthur felt a sense of isolation. He remembered a time when laughter filled his home, when his children ran around, their faces glowing with joy. But now, they barely spoke. He had lost touch with them, and the distance felt insurmountable. "I should have tried harder," he sighed, the pain evident in his voice. "I should have been there for them." With a heavy heart, Arthur decided that it was time to confront his past. He needed answers about the family he had lost, the dreams he had let slip away. He rummaged through old boxes filled with memories, each item stirring up a mix of joy and sorrow. In one box, he found a collection of letters, yellowed and fragile with age. As he read through them, memories flooded back. They were letters from his late wife, filled with love and hope. "We can't give up, Arthur. Our family is worth fighting for," one letter read, her handwriting delicate and beautiful. But the tone shifted as he reached the last few letters. They spoke of disappointment, of a man who was absent more than he was present. "You chose your job over us," the letters seemed to accuse. Arthur felt the tears welling up in his eyes. "I'm sorry, my love," he choked out, looking up at the empty room. "I should have listened." Just when he thought he had uncovered all the layers of his past, Arthur stumbled upon an old, sealed envelope. It was hidden beneath a pile of dust-covered books. The envelope was crumpled and worn, but there was something familiar about the handwriting. He carefully opened it, and his breath caught in his throat. Inside was a letter addressed to him, but it was not from anyone he recognized. It spoke of a connection, a family secret that had been buried for years. "You have a son," it read. "He needs to know the truth." Arthur's heart raced. Could it be true? He had a son? He felt a mix of emotions, confusion, fear, and a flicker of hope. "I need to find him," he thought, his mind racing. But how? He held the letter tightly, his hands trembling. The name was not familiar, but the idea of reconnecting with a child he never knew he had filled him with a sense of urgency. "What if he hates me?" Arthur whispered, the thought sending a chill down his spine. Sitting back in his chair, Arthur closed his eyes and took a deep breath. "I have to try," he resolved. The emptiness he felt was overwhelming, but perhaps this was a chance to fill it with something meaningful. As he gathered his thoughts, he realized that he needed to confront his own demons before reaching out to this son. There were many things he had to resolve within himself. "I can't let fear hold me back any longer," he said, his voice firmer now. The letter lay open on the table, a beacon of hope amidst the shadows of his regrets. Arthur knew he was on the brink of a journey that could change everything. But first, he had to find the strength to face the past he had long avoided and the future that was waiting just out of reach. With a newfound determination, Arthur picked up a pen and began to write. "Dear son," he started, his heart pounding as he poured out the words he had kept hidden for far too long. Gideon Thorne sat in his dimly lit study, the weight of the evening pressing down on him. His hand trembled as he turned the delicate letter over, the handwriting familiar yet distant. It was a letter from his late mother, one he had never seen before. As he read the words, a chill ran through him. "The man who should have been your father," it said, referring to Arthur Pritchard. The realization hit him like a thunderbolt. Arthur, the man he had just fired, was his biological father. Gideon's heart raced as he replayed the scene of Arthur's dismissal in his mind. The elderly man's face, filled with sorrow and confusion, haunted him. How could he have been so blind to the connection that had been right in front of him all along? Gideon dropped the letter onto the desk, his mind swirling with thoughts. He felt guilt wash over him, mixing with anger at himself for not knowing. "How could I have done this?" he muttered, staring at the ceiling as if it held the answers. He had viewed firing Arthur as a necessary step for efficiency, but now it felt like a cruel betrayal. He paced the room, each step echoing the turmoil inside him. The man who had dedicated over 30 years to the company was more than just an employee. He was family, and Gideon had severed that bond without a second thought. "What have I done?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. As the minutes ticked by, the urgency to find Arthur grew stronger. Gideon grabbed his coat and headed for the door, determination etched on his face. He had to make things right. He needed to confront the man he had wronged, the man who held the key to his past. The streets of Portland were quiet as he drove, the city lights blurring past him. Gideon's heart raced, not just from the speed of the car, but from the fear of what he might find. Would Arthur even want to see him? Would he understand the gravity of the situation? Gideon struggled to reconcile the man he had dismissed with the father he had lost all those years ago. After what felt like hours, he arrived at a modest apartment building. The stark contrast between this place and his luxurious office was jarring. Gideon hesitated for a moment, his hand hovering over the doorbell. Finally, he pressed it, the sound echoing through the stillness. The door creaked open, revealing Arthur. His face was worn, marked by the passage of time and the burden of loss. "What do you want?" Arthur asked, his voice low and filled with caution. Gideon swallowed hard. "Arthur, I need to talk to you. It's important." Arthur's eyes narrowed, suspicion flooding his expression. "Important? You mean after firing me?" "I know I made a terrible mistake," Gideon admitted, feeling the weight of his words. "But there's something you need to know." Arthur crossed his arms, his body tense. "I don't want to hear excuses. You've already taken enough from me." Gideon took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts. "Please, just listen. My mother, she wrote a letter. It mentions you. It says you are the man who should have been my father. I didn't know. I never knew." The silence that followed was heavy, both men searching each other's eyes for understanding. Arthur's expression shifted, the walls he had built around himself beginning to crack. You didn't know?" "No," Gideon replied, his voice trembling. "I thought you were just an employee. I didn't see the truth. And now, I regret it more than I can say." Arthur looked away, his gaze fixed on the ground. "You've caused a lot of hurt, Gideon. I don't know if I can just forgive you." "I don't expect you to," Gideon said, desperation creeping into his voice. "But I need to try. I want to understand. I want to know you." Arthur hesitated, his heart battling with his anger and pain. After a long pause, he finally nodded. "Fine. But I'm not making any promises." Gideon felt a glimmer of hope. "That's all I ask. Let's just talk." As they stepped inside the apartment, the weight of the past lingered between them, but for the first time, there was a chance for healing, a chance to rebuild what had been lost. Gideon Thorne stood outside Arthur Pritchard's modest apartment, his heart racing. The building loomed before him, a stark contrast to the opulence of his own life. He felt the weight of his decision pressing down on him, a mix of fear and regret swirling in his mind. Taking a deep breath, he approached the door and knocked. After a moment, the door creaked open, revealing Arthur, looking older and wearier than Gideon had expected. The lines on his face told stories of hardship and resilience. Arthur's eyes narrowed as he took in the sight of his son, the man who had dismissed him from his job. "What do you want?" Arthur asked, his voice low and cautious. "I need to talk to you, Arthur," Gideon replied, trying to keep his tone steady. "Please." Arthur hesitated, glancing back into the dim apartment, then stepped aside to let Gideon in. The air inside was thick with an unspoken tension. Gideon felt out of place among the faded furniture and the clutter of a life lived simply. "Sit," Arthur said, pointing to an old chair. Gideon sank into it, feeling the weight of the moment. "Why did you come here?" Arthur asked, crossing his arms. To gloat about your success? To tell me how much better your life is now? No, it's not like that, Gideon said, shaking his head. I wanted to apologize. I made a terrible mistake when I fired you. Arthur scoffed, his expression hardening. A mistake? You ended my life as I knew it. Do you have any idea what that felt like? I do now, Gideon admitted, his voice trembling slightly. I didn't understand before. I was so focused on my career, on being efficient, that I didn't see the human cost. Arthur's face softened for a moment, but he quickly masked it with anger. You think you can just come here and fix everything with a few words? You don't know anything about me or the sacrifices I made. Gideon leaned forward, desperation in his eyes. I want to understand. I want to know you. I didn't know that you were my father until recently. Arthur froze, his expression shifting from anger to disbelief. What did you just say? I found a letter from my mother, Gideon explained, his heart racing. She wrote about you. She called you the man who should have been your father. Arthur's eyes widened, the weight of the revelation settling between them. You're my son, he whispered, as if trying to grasp the reality of it. All these years, I thought you were just a stranger. Yes, Gideon said, emotion flooding his voice. And I've spent my whole life not knowing you. I want to change that. Change? Arthur shook his head, his voice filled with bitterness. You think you can just erase the years of hurt? You think I can forgive you for what you did? Gideon took a deep breath, his heart aching. I don't expect you to forgive me right away. I just want a chance to make things right. I want to know you, to hear your story. Arthur looked away, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. You have no idea what it was like to lose everything, to watch your dreams slip away. I can only imagine, Gideon said softly. But I want to listen. I want to learn about you, about your life. Please, give me that chance. The room fell silent, the tension hanging thick in the air. After a moment, Arthur spoke, his voice quieter now. I don't know if I can do that, Gideon. I'm not sure I'm ready to let you in. I understand, Gideon replied, his heart heavy. But I hope you will consider it. Can we at least agree to meet again? Maybe talk more? Arthur studied Gideon for a long moment, weighing the possibility of reconciliation. Finally, he sighed, a mix of resignation and hope in his gaze. Fine, we can meet again, but don't think this will be easy. Gideon nodded, a flicker of relief washing over him. I don't expect it to be. I just want to try. As Gideon stood to leave, a new understanding lingered between them. The road ahead would be difficult, but for the first time, there was a glimmer of hope. They exchanged a tentative handshake, both men knowing that this was just the beginning of a long journey toward healing. As the days turned into weeks, Gideon and Arthur began to meet regularly. Their meeting started in a small coffee shop on the corner of a busy street. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee hung in the air, mingling with the sound of chatter from other patrons. It was a cozy place, a stark contrast to Gideon's luxurious office, yet it felt right for their fragile connection. Do you remember the first time we met? Gideon asked one afternoon, stirring his coffee with a slight smile. He looked at Arthur, who sat across from him, his hands wrapped around a warm mug. Arthur paused, his brow furrowing as he searched his memory. I remember you walking into my life like a storm, he replied, a hint of humor in his voice. You didn't even know I existed, and yet you changed everything for me. Gideon felt a pang in his chest at the weight of Arthur's words. I didn't know then, he admitted softly. I didn't understand the impact my actions would have. Arthur sighed, his gaze drifting to the window. Life has a way of teaching us lessons, doesn't it? I made promises I couldn't keep. I chose work over family. I thought I was doing the right thing. Gideon leaned in, eager to hear more. What kind of promises? I promised I would always provide for my family, Arthur began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. But in doing so, I lost touch with them. They needed me there, not just financially, but emotionally. Gideon nodded, feeling the weight of Arthur's struggles. I understand that all too well. I thought success would fill the emptiness inside me, but it hasn't. It only makes me feel more alone. Arthur looked at Gideon, his eyes softening. You are not alone anymore. You have a chance to change that. With each meeting, their conversations dug deeper into their pasts. They shared stories of their lives, slowly building a bridge of understanding and empathy. Arthur spoke of his early years, filled with dreams and aspirations. I wanted to be a writer, he revealed one day, a hint of pride in his voice. But I chose stability over passion. Gideon listened intently. What stopped you? He asked. The fear of failure, Arthur admitted. I was afraid of not being able to support my family, so I let my dreams slip away. As the weeks went by, Arthur also opened up about the sacrifices he made. When your mother got sick, I worked double shifts. I thought that money would help ease her pain, he explained, his voice trembling slightly. But I was wrong. She needed me there, by her side. Gideon's heart ached for his father. I never knew. I only knew the man who wasn't there, he said quietly. That was my choice, Arthur replied, his tone firm yet gentle. But I want you to know that I always loved you, even from a distance. One afternoon, Arthur shared a cherished memory that struck a chord in Gideon. I remember taking you to the park when you were just a little boy, he said, a smile breaking through his serious demeanor. You loved the swings. I pushed you higher and higher until you thought you could touch the sky. Gideon felt a rush of warmth. I can picture it, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I always wanted my father to be there. Arthur nodded, understanding the unspoken longing in Gideon's words. And I wanted to be there. I missed so much, he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. In that moment, both men acknowledged their pasts, the pain they carried, and the potential for a new relationship. They felt a shared vulnerability, a bond beginning to form despite the scars that life had etched on their hearts. As they sat in the coffee shop, the world outside continued to buzz with life. But within that small, intimate space, Gideon and Arthur found solace in each other's company. They were two men, once strangers, now slowly becoming family. The journey towards forgiveness was just beginning, but for the first time, they dared to hope that it might be worth the effort. With the bond between Gideon and Arthur growing stronger, Gideon felt a mix of excitement and nervousness as he prepared for a family gathering. It was a significant step for both of them, one that could either strengthen their connection or bring back old wounds. He stood in front of the mirror, adjusting his tie, his mind racing. What if they don't accept him? He thought, biting his lip. As the day approached, Gideon sent Arthur a text, inviting him to join the family gathering at his house. It will be good to have you there, he wrote, hoping to convey his eagerness. Arthur replied with a simple, I'll be there, but Gideon could sense the weight behind those words. The evening of the gathering arrived, and Gideon felt a knot in his stomach. He glanced towards the door every few minutes, waiting for Arthur to arrive. When the doorbell finally rang, he took a deep breath and opened the door. Arthur, he said, a smile breaking across his face. Gideon, Arthur replied, his voice steady but warm. He held a small, wrapped gift in his hands. I brought something for your family. Gideon's heart swelled with pride. You didn't have to. Just being here is enough. As they walked into the living room, Gideon could feel the tension in the air. His family was already gathered, chatting and laughing. He introduced Arthur, his voice slightly trembling. Everyone, this is my father, Arthur Pritchard. The room fell silent. Eyes widened, and whispers began to travel among the guests. Gideon's mother, who had always been the heart of the family, stepped forward, her expression a mix of surprise and curiosity. Hello, Arthur. It's nice to finally meet you, she said, extending her hand. Arthur took her hand, a hint of nervousness in his demeanor. Thank you for having me, he replied, his voice steady despite the situation. As the evening progressed, Gideon watched his family interact with Arthur, and he felt the tension begin to ease. They offered Arthur drinks and tried to include him in conversations. He could see Arthur relaxing, his shoulders dropping as he engaged with them. "Tell us about yourself, Arthur," Gideon's sister Lily asked, her eyes sparkling with curiosity. Arthur smiled gently. "Well, I've spent the last 30 years working in a small company, mostly behind the scenes. I enjoy gardening and reading. It's a simple life, but it has its joys." Gideon noticed how his family listened attentively, their initial shock fading into interest. "What do you like to read?" his brother Mark inquired, leaning forward. "Mostly historical fiction," Arthur replied. "I find comfort in stories that connect the past to the present." As the conversation flowed, Gideon felt a warmth spreading through him. He was beginning to see a new side of Arthur, one that resonated with his family. The laughter and shared stories created a bond that he had hoped for. At one point, Gideon's mother brought out the dessert, a homemade pie. "Arthur, would you like to help me serve?" she asked, gesturing towards the kitchen. "Sure, I'd love to," Arthur said, a smile lighting up his face. As they moved to the kitchen, Gideon overheard them chatting softly. "You know, Gideon speaks very highly of you," his mother said. Arthur nodded. "It's been a long journey for us, but I am grateful to be here." Gideon watched them, feeling a mix of gratitude and relief. This was not just a family gathering, it was a moment of healing. Later in the evening, when the guests began to leave, Gideon felt a sense of accomplishment. He turned to Arthur, who stood by the door, a small smile on his face. "Thank you for coming tonight," Gideon said, his voice sincere. "I'm glad I did," Arthur replied. It felt good to be part of something again. As they embraced, Gideon realized how far they had come. The past still held shadows, but they were learning to step into the light together. Reflecting on the evening, Gideon understood the importance of family, forgiveness, and the enduring power of love. This gathering was just the beginning of a new chapter, one filled with hope and the promise of rebuilding lost connections. Share this story if you believe that love can conquer even the toughest challenges. Leave a comment about how an unexpected visit has changed your life, and subscribe to the channel for more heartwarming stories like this one.